Imagine a scenario that seems absolutely impossible and completely contradicts common sense. You walk into the office of Marshal Georgy Zhukov in 1945, and on the wall, instead of a portrait of Stalin, you see a ceremonial portrait of the leader of the Third Reich. Sounds like madness, like a script for a cheap alternative history movie, because we know exactly who fought whom and who the enemy was. However, when we begin to carefully study the events of 1812, casting aside school textbooks, we encounter inconsistencies of exactly this magnitude. Official history offers us a neat picture of patriotic resistance, but documents from that era and strange artifacts paint a completely different reality. It is generally accepted that Napoleon invaded Russia to crush Alexander I, but if you look at the French emperor's personal correspondence, a strange vacuum appears. There is almost no mention of Russia as the main political enemy in the form we are used to perceiving it. 41 instead, European sources of that time and maps constantly feature names like Muscovy, Great Tartary, and references to a confrontation with certain Asian hordes. One gets the impression that the Grand Army was marching to fight not against St. Petersburg, but against a completely different force, which was subsequently carefully erased from the pages of history books. The geography of this war raises even more questions for anyone familiar with strategy. The capital of the Russian Empire, the center of administrative power, and the home of the emperor was St. Petersburg. This city was much closer to the borders from which the French were advancing and was strategically more vulnerable. Any logical military commander wanting to decapitate an enemy state would have directed his strike there. But Napoleon, a recognized military genius, makes an inexplicable maneuver. He ignores the capital and leads a huge army deep into the continent towards Moscow. Why? Why did he need an old merchant city if the political heart of the empire was beating on the banks of the Neva River? This only makes sense in one case: if the real capital of the power he was fighting was actually in Moscow, not St. Petersburg. The oddities continue in details that are presented to us as historical anecdotes. We are told how Napoleon waited on Poklonnaya Hill for boyars with the keys to the city. But wait a minute. The boyar class was officially abolished by Peter the Great back in the early 18th century, more than 100 years before these events. Expecting a delegation of boyars in 1812 is like expecting knights in shining armor at UN negotiations today. Either French intelligence committed a catastrophic failure by not knowing who lived in the enemy country, or those called boyars actually existed, but belonged to that same vanished Muscovite Tartary that official historians prefer to remain silent about. We are told that Moscow burned down because it was wooden. This is a convenient explanation for school children, but it ignores the facts. The construction of wooden houses in the city center had been banned by special decrees since the time of Peter the Great to avoid large-scale fires. By 1812, the center of Moscow was built of stone and brick. And stone cities do not flare up like matchsticks from a stray spark. Nevertheless, the events that unfolded that summer are described as a global catastrophe that destroyed the city to the ground. And here we approach a line where political intrigues end and a real nightmare begins. Paper can be rewritten, maps can be redrawn, but it is impossible to hide the traces of the physical destruction of a city. What happened in Moscow does not fit the description of an ordinary fire, and eyewitness accounts make one's blood run cold, hinting at the use of technologies that, according to the official version, simply could not have existed then. Brigadier General of the French Army, Count Philippe de Ségur, stood at the window watching with horror as flames devoured not just wooden structures, but the solid stone walls of the Kremlin. In his memoirs, he would later describe this spectacle as something beyond human understanding. The army, which only yesterday considered itself a glorious victor, suddenly turned into a band of criminals whom the heavens themselves seemed to be judging. Eyewitness testimonies from both sides of the front paint a picture of a technological catastrophe, not an ordinary fire. Officers located in different parts of the city independently reported strange celestial phenomena. Above the city, they observed not just flying sparks, but actual fireballs descending from the sky. One such ball, according to Segur's records, descended directly onto the palace of Prince Trubetskoy, instantly igniting it. This description resembles a targeted bombardment or the use of an unknown weapon, rather than the chaotic spread of fire from a torch. Above the city, they observed not just flying sparks, but actual fireballs descending from the sky. One such ball, according to Segur's records, descended directly onto the palace of Prince Trubetskoy, instantly igniting it. This description resembles a targeted bombardment or the use of an unknown weapon, rather than the chaotic spread of fire from a torch. Even more inexplicable is the nature of the destruction. Stone, as we know, does not burn. It can get cracked from heat, but not disappear. However, in Moscow in 1812, stone buildings literally exploded from within. Eyewitnesses described a terrifying sequence: a light crackle, a bright flash, a stream of smoke, and only ruins remained where a monumental structure stood. Brick and stone crumbled into dust, as if under the influence of a colossal shock wave or vibration. Such material behavior cannot be explained by burning wooden furniture inside the rooms. Casualty statistics finally destroy the myth of an ordinary fire. For comparison, we can take the documented fire of 1737. Back then, Moscow was indeed predominantly wooden. The fire raged terribly, destroying thousands of houses. But how many people died? Only 94. People managed to run away to save themselves from the slowly advancing fire. In 1812, in a city built of stone, by the admission of the French themselves, about 30,000 soldiers of Napoleon's army perished. This is a huge figure, comparable to losses in a major battle such as Borodino. How could 30,000 healthy, mobile men burn alive in a city they could have walked out of? This indicates that the damaging factor was instantaneous and inescapable, giving no chance for salvation. The strangeness continued. Even after the fire died down, continuous heavy rains began to fall over the ruins of the city, as if nature was trying to wash away traces of something poisonous. Survivors, both Russians and French, described their condition as deep shock. They wandered through the ashes like sleepwalkers who had lost their will and reason. Many suffered from unexplained weakness and illnesses, the symptoms of which would today cause doctors to suspect radiation sickness or severe chemical poisoning. Neither Russia nor France benefited from such destruction of resources and people. This catastrophe equalized everyone. Yesterday's enemies, shaken by what they saw, warmed themselves by the same fires, forgetting about the war. It seemed that in that moment, they ceased to be opponents and became witnesses to the destruction of something third, something much more ancient and important. And if you look closely at the behavior of these two armies, you can notice a frightening detail. They were suspiciously similar, like two hands of the same body, performing perhaps the same task of clearing the territory. If you look closely at the opposing sides of the conflict of 1812, it starts to feel like we are looking into a mirror that only slightly distorts the reflection. Official history insists on reconcilable enmity between the Russian Empire and France, but the daily reality of that war throws up facts that completely destroy this picture. One of the most discouraging aspects is the soldiers' uniforms. It would seem vital on the battlefield to instantly distinguish friend from foe. However, in the famous hussar and partisan Denis Davidov scribed very telling curiosities in his memoirs. During raids, his detachments often came under attack from Russian peasants. Ordinary people, seeing the uniforms, the cut, the epaulets, could not find differences between the Russian liberators and the French invaders. Davidov and his men had to change into simple peasant caftans and grow beards so that their own people would stop seeing them as enemies. There are claims that such confusion was not accidental. Evil tongues mention correspondence between Alexander I and Napoleon, where the monarchs allegedly discussed the unification of the color and style of military uniforms. If this is true, then we are facing a unique case in world history. This looks more like preparation for a joint police operation than a total war of annihilation. The language issue causes even deeper cognitive dissonance. We are used to hearing about the patriotic war of 1812 and the rise of the Russian national spirit. But why then was all the documentation of this war conducted in the language of the aggressor? Alexander I's manifesto on the results of the war was written in French. The Tsar's decrees were issued in French. An album with portraits of war heroes released in St. Petersburg was printed entirely in the language of the defeated enemy. Relations between the emperors also raise a lot of questions. On a commemorative sign installed at the crossing of the Berezina River, the site of the tragic death of thousands of French soldiers, the profiles of two emperors are depicted at once, Alexander and Napoleon. What did descendants want to say by this? That both won, or that they acted in concert? Even more strange was the celebration of the centennial of the war in 1912. At the Jubilee exhibition in St. Petersburg, portraits of Napoleon were lovingly laid out with fresh flowers. Paper documents can be interpreted in two ways. However, there is something that is much harder to fake: granite and bronze. Monuments erected in honor of those events tell a story that makes one feel truly uneasy. The most glaring inconsistency concerns the main state symbols. The coat of arms of the Russian Empire was a double-headed eagle, looking west and east. The coat of arms of Napoleonic France was a single-headed eagle, looking in one direction. Logic suggests that French eagles should be on the graves of French soldiers, and Russian ones on monuments to Russian heroes. But when we approach the monument dedicated to the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Mikhail Kutuzov, a shock awaits us. The top of the obelisk is adorned not by the sovereign double-headed symbol of Russia, but by exactly the same French single-headed eagle. This cannot be written off as a mistake. Monuments of this level were approved personally by the emperor, Imagining a monument to Marshal Zhukov, topped with the heraldry of the Third Reich, is unthinkable. However, in the case of Kutuzov and other monuments to liberators, we see exactly this. Single-headed eagles are everywhere. This forces us to assume that in 1812, this symbol was not exclusively the mark of the enemy. Perhaps it designated a united army in which Russia and France acted together. Relations between the emperors also raise a lot of questions. On a commemorative sign installed at the crossing of the Berezina River, the site of the tragic death of thousands of French soldiers, the profiles of two emperors are depicted at once, Alexander and Napoleon. What did descendants want to say by this? That both won? Or that they acted in concert? Even more strange was the celebration of the centennial of the war in 1912. At the Jubilee exhibition in St. Petersburg, portraits of Napoleon were lovingly laid out with fresh flowers. Paper documents can be interpreted in two ways. However, there is something that is much harder to fake. The oddities continue in numismatics. On the medal dedicated to the Battle of Borodino, the warriors are dressed not in 19th century uniforms, but in classic Roman armor. Moreover, battle scenes often feature three warriors, which transparently hints at the presence of a third side to the conflict. If Alexander and Napoleon were just two duelists, who is this third one? The final verdict on official geography is delivered by a map carved on one of the memorial stones of that era. It is supposed to depict the Russian Empire that defended its borders, but the borders of the state on this map strangely end at the Ural Mountains. The vast expanses of Siberia and the Far East, which today are an integral part of the country, are simply absent. This stone evidence places a frightening but inevitable question before us. If the Russian Empire ended at the Urals, what was further out there in the east? A huge void. History does not tolerate a vacuum. There must have been a state possessing huge territory and resources. It was likely against this colossal neighbor that the monarchs of Europe and the St. Petersburg House of Romanov united. The answer can be found in geographical atlases published before the 19th century. There, across the vast expanses of Eurasia, from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean, stretched a state designated by large letters, Grande Tartary, or Great Tartary. Its composition included Muscovite Tartary, with its capital in Moscow. Relations between the emperors also raise a lot of questions. On a commemorative sign installed at the crossing of the Berezina River, the site of the tragic death of thousands of French soldiers, the profiles of two emperors are depicted at once, Alexander and Napoleon. What did descendants want to say by this? That both won, or that they acted in concert? Even more strange was the celebration of the centennial of the war in 1912. At the Jubilee exhibition in St. Petersburg, portraits of Napoleon were lovingly laid out with fresh flowers. Paper documents can be interpreted in two ways. However, there is something that is much harder to fake. The oddities continue in numismatics. However, as often happens in major crimes, after the murder of the victim, the question of dividing the inheritance inevitably arises. War is a colossal expense, and someone had to pay for this banquet. Any crime, whether it is a household robbery or the destruction of an entire civilization, always leaves a financial trail. Money is the blood of war, and its movement often says much more about real motives and the pompous speeches of generals. When the smoke over the ashes of Moscow cleared, a logical question arose. Where did the untold riches of the ancient capital disappear to? They seem to dissolve into thin air. However, but if we look at the financial results of the war, a picture opens up that completely overturns the notions of winner and loser. By the laws of war, the losing side pays reparations. The winner loots, takes trophies, and issues bills. But the behavior of the Russian army in Paris in 1814 was unprecedentedly mild. Moreover, there's a documented fact that historians try not to advertise. The commander of the Russian occupation corps, Count Mikhail Vorontsov, before leaving France, personally paid off all the debts of his officers and soldiers to French creditors. We are talking about a colossal sum equivalent to approximately 30 tons of silver. Think about the absurdity of the situation. Russia, the victorious country whose ancient capital lies in ruins, whose lands are ravaged, instead of demanding compensation, pays the defeated France huge amounts of money. This cannot be explained by nobility or chivalry. In big politics, such concepts do not exist. But in business, this is called final settlement of the contract. If we assume that Napoleon performed the function of a hired cleaner, hired to destroy Muscovite Tartary, then the vanished Moscow gold became the first part of his fee, and the payments of Vorontsov represent the closing of the remaining debt to partners. We live in a world drawn by the winners. History textbooks are merely an agreed-upon version of events, convenient for the ruling elites. But the truth, like a sprout through asphalt, always breaks through to the outside. The facts we have analyzed, from strange fires to French eagles on monuments to Russian heroes, are just the tip of the iceberg. The depth of the rabbit hole is much greater than you can imagine.